All right, so get this. Are the Gospels really reliable accounts of Jesus' resurrection? We're diving deep into that today. You guys sent in this Reddit thread from our debate of religion, and whoa, people are fired up about this. It's like a historical showdown. I mean, we're talking about the biggest event in Christianity, but looking at it through a historical lens, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is how similar this whole debate is to what you might hear in like a university history seminar. It just goes to show you how intertwined these questions of evidence and belief are with understanding the past, you know?
Totally. And this Reddit thread does not hold back. The original poster jumps right in saying, hold on, the Gospels were written decades after Jesus.
Hmm.
They're talking about how memories can get foggy, stories change when people tell them, and maybe there are even some sources we don't even know about. They're
Right.
basically saying we can't treat the Gospels like a history textbook, especially when it comes to the resurrection.
Right. And I think a lot of the skepticism comes from this idea of, well, distortion, right? Like, think about how even our own WN memories can be kind of unreliable, even for things we experienced firsthand. Now, throw in cultural expectations, people wanting things to fit their beliefs. Suddenly, that gap of a few decades between what happened and when the Gospels were written starts to feel a lot bigger, you know?
And one commenter made this point that really stuck with me. They were like, okay, if people were seriously rising from the dead and just walking around Jerusalem,
Mm.
wouldn't we hear about that somewhere else? Like, that's not something you just leave out of the history books.
It's a really good question, and it gets at a big thing historians think about. Corroboration. It's like when you find these little details about an event mentioned in totally different places, even by people who might not even believe the event happened, it makes the whole thing feel more believable.
So even a skeptic mentioning, like, rumors of resurrections, even if they thought it was nonsense, could actually help the case.
Exactly, because it shows that the idea was out there, people were talking about it, it was part of the conversation, right? But of course, the folks on the thread who believe the Gospels are reliable, they've got some pretty strong arguments too.
Oh yeah, they came ready to debate. They were saying that compared to other ancient texts that we do consider reliable, the time gap between Jesus' life and the Gospels isn't even that long. I mean, we rely on accounts from way longer ago in history all the time.
And that's really important to keep in mind. We can't just have this one definition of reliable or unreliable for every old document, right? It depends on the context. What kind of claims are being made? What other sources do we have from that time? It's all connected.
So are you saying a few decades might not even be that big of a deal, historically speaking?
Right. And that's where the whole discussion about memory gets really interesting.
Yeah, and it's not like a straight line, you
Hmm.
know, especially when we're talking about these huge life-changing events.
So not like, what did I have for breakfast, but more like, where were you on 9/11 kind of thing. Exactly. Think about your strongest memory. Now, imagine that, but for a whole community. For early Christians, the resurrection wasn't just some event in the past, it was everything. Their whole faith hinged on it. It makes sense that the main details would be crystal clear in their minds, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. But even if their memories were super vivid, wouldn't the stories still change when they told them, like that telephone game thing?
Okay, well, this is where it gets really interesting. The believers in the thread said having multiple gospels actually makes them more reliable.
Wait, what? How does having different versions of the same story make it more believable?
Think of it like you're trying to figure out what happened at, say, a party. You might talk to different people who were there, and they'll each remember different things. Maybe they saw things from a different angle or whatever. But by putting all those pieces together,
You can start to see the bigger picture.
exactly, it's like having a built-in fact check. The difference is actually HELP us get closer to what really happened.
Wow, okay. I've never thought of it that way.
And one commenter even compared it to historians who interview veterans of World War II. I mean, those firsthand accounts are still super valuable, even decades later, even if they're jumbled or contradict each other sometimes.
That's a good point. Just because a story gets told and retold doesn't mean it's made up. Sometimes those different perspectives can give you a much deeper understanding of what went down.
Absolutely. But the big question is still there. How do we deal with these challenges of interpreting history? Especially when we're talking about something as extraordinary as a resurrection.
Right. It's not like we can just look it up on Wikipedia. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Fact check. True or false? It's just not that simple.
And that's exactly why this whole conversation is so important, you know? It makes us really think about the limits of what we can know about the past. How much can we really know? And what counts as evidence? How does our own faith or lack of faith influence how we see things?
Yeah, it feels like you're right. Like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
And that's the thing about history, isn't it? It's not always about finding the one right answer. It's about wrestling with these big questions. What do we believe? What can we actually prove? And are we willing to consider possibilities that might seem, well, impossible?
So what does that mean for us? For anyone listening who's trying to figure out what they believe about the resurrection, do we have to pick a side, be super skeptical, OR, just take it all on faith?
I don't think it has to be either or. We can appreciate how difficult it is to know for sure what really happened back then, but we can also recognize the impact the Gospels have had and still have on so many people's lives.
That makes sense. It's kind of like you can enjoy a piece of music even if you don't know anything about how it was written, right?
Exactly. There's a certain beauty in the mystery, right? Engaging with history is kind of like that. Sometimes you have to be okay with not having all the answers.
Okay, so for everyone listening who's still thinking about the resurrection, the Gospels, this whole idea of what's reliable, what's our takeaway here?
Maybe the takeaway is that history is messy. It's not always a straight line from A to B. It's made up of different perspectives, interpretations, and yeah, even faith plays a role. But grappling with these questions, even the ones that seem impossible to answer, it can help us understand the past A&D ourselves in a much deeper way, I think.
Wow, well said. That's a great place to leave it for today. We want to hear from what stood out to you from this conversation. Hit us up on social media and let us know. And until next time, keep digging for those answers.